right. Thank you all for coming. So my name is Larry Kessler with the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research. Today, I'm pleased to release our annual economic report to the governor. So in this report, we provide a short-term economic outlook for the state economy looking 10 quarters out, as well as do more long-term economic projections looking 10 years ahead. So today, I'll make some brief remarks at some of the highlights of the report, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. As Aaron said, you can put some questions in the chat box, or you could just we can just talk after I make my remarks. So Tennessee continues to see slower but still positive economic growth as the effects of the pandemic and ensuing recovery continue to dissipate. Following 2 years of extremely strong growth in both 2021 and 22, Tennessee real GDP, which measures the value of all goods and services produced in the economy and is really our best measure of overall economic activity in the state, it slowed to a below trend rate of 1.9% in 2023. Looking ahead, the state is projected to see moderate economic growth over the next 2 years as well, as the economy continues to stabilize. So with Tennessee seeing a slightly slower rate of GDP growth than the nation this year, but then stronger growth than the US next year. Specifically, we're forecasting that Tennessee real GDP will expand by 2.4% this year and then 2.5% in 2025, while the US is projected to grow by 2.7% this year and 2.0% in 2025. And slower state growth in 2024, it's largely driven by timing as the state economy recovered more quickly from the pandemic and is therefore stabilizing a bit sooner as well. Job growth in Tennessee continues to moderate also. The state added roughly 58,000 new jobs to payrolls in 2023, which was roughly in line with kind of pre-pandemic averages, but well below the 100,000 plus job gains that we saw over the last couple of years, so both in 21 and 22. Monthly job gains have slowed further in recent quarters, and as a result, we're projecting an addition of roughly 22,000 jobs added to the state economy in 2024, and then 36,000 in 2025. Encouragingly, however, Tennessee has about 184,000 more workers on payrolls today than we did prior to the pandemic. Nonetheless, the state continues to face a persistent shortage of workers. This is not due to a disappearance of workers by any mean, but it was largely driven by an incredibly strong economic recovery, leading to an elevated number of job openings that went unfilled. But this does suggest that the state labor market just might not be large enough to keep pace with a sustained period of above trend economic growth like we saw during the recovery. And this is certainly not unique to Tennessee. We've seen a very similar labor shortage that has persisted for the nation as a whole. But as economic growth softens, we do expect that the labor shortage will recede, and evidence of this is already apparent. As of September, the shortfall of workers has decreased to about 58,000 in Tennessee, which is the lowest that it's been in nearly 3.5 years. By comparison, it was at 190,000 just last year, which is when it peaked. Importantly, however, future job growth could be limited to some extent by the shortage of available workers, especially as the baby boomer generation continues to age out of the workforce. And then as job growth slows, Tennessee's unemployment rate, which hit an all-time low of about 3% this past summer, it'll slowly trend upward to an annual average of 3.3% next year and 3.4% in 2026. But this would still represent a very low rate of unemployment from a historical standpoint. And furthermore, Tennessee's unemployment rate will remain below the national rate, which is projected to increase to 4.5% by 2026. We've also seen relatively strong wage gains over the last few years. An average income in Tennessee, it now stands at $65,000 per person. So this is a huge increase compared to 2019 when per capita income was less than $49,000. Some of this, of course, was inflation driven, but some also represents real wage gains. But nonetheless, state income levels still lag behind the national average, which currently sits at $72,000 per person. Furthermore, average income or average wages in Tennessee vary considerably across sectors. So workers in some of the white collar fields, such as financial activities and professional and business services, they're earning a little less than $40 an hour on average, whereas those working in leisure and hospitality are still earning less than $20 an hour. So while earnings for the average Tennessean have risen appreciably, there's still a wide pay gap across jobs and across industries. So then, in addition to the economic forecast, the report also provides a summary of the updated state population projections released by the Boyd Center in collaboration with the Tennessee State Data Center. So of note, the state population is projected to increase by 600,000 people between 2020 and 2030, and this would be slightly higher than the gains we saw during the previous decade. But population growth is projected to slow in the ensuing decade, adding roughly 430,000 new residents between 2030 and 2040. And this slowdown is driven by two important factors. First, net migration, which has risen to kind of record levels over the last few years, it's projected to recede to more normalized levels over the long term. And then second, low fertility rates coupled with rising deaths among an aging population will limit population growth over the long term as well. So between now and 2040, the number of Tennesseans aged 65 and older is projected to increase by roughly 12%, and the number of those aged 85 and over is projected to grow by more than 70%. So, and most of this growth will be driven by aging among current residents rather than an influx of out-of-state retirees. And importantly, from an economics perspective, this will lead to a smaller potential workforce in Tennessee, as well as an increase in the demand for healthcare and other support services. And then finally, the last chapter of the report is on something topical every year, and this year it's about artificial intelligence. So this chapter provides a brief description of many of the AI applications currently available, many of which already exceed the performance of an average human. We also examine AI adoption rates across states, industries, and firm sizes. According to census data, roughly 4.9% of Tennessee firms use some form of AI to produce a good or a service, and that's very close to the US adoption rate of 5%. So in that chapter, there's also a discussion on the potential impacts of AI on employment and how AI-focused education and workforce development can play key roles in helping to mitigate job losses over the long term. So it's a really interesting read. It was written by my colleague, Ed Taylor, and I'd encourage everyone to check it out. So with that, I'll stop and answer any questions that anyone has.
Hey, Larry, thanks for the presentation. This is David over at the Chattanooga Times Free Press.
Hey, David.
I was curious. I know that the reporter kind of talked about some of the potential drawbacks of AI, and some of those were potentially increasing, um, I guess, the potential for housing discrimination and also income inequality. And I was kind of curious about just if you could kind of expand on how that could kind of play out, and I guess if there are any kind of legislative ways the state could address any of those drawbacks. I know another one is also energy. It's energy requirement.
Yeah, I think there have been some kind of housing websites and house sellers that have used kind of algorithms and machine learning to kind of price gap or like increase the price of homes, kind of looking at overall demand for homes and then increasing the price of homes in those areas and much higher than would be if it was just kind of a free market. So I think that could certainly lead to housing issues in different areas, and it could also lead to income inequality as well. But that, and then also there's generally the view is that a lot of AI kind of applications could be used to as substitutes for some lower wage jobs, and that could lead to job loss among some lower wage employees. Whereas those who have put the money in, invested to make the AI, they're going to still profit from using AI, and they'll be able to do so while also employing fewer workers. So that would certainly lead to kind of a more and even more of a focus of more money going to a smaller proportion of people.
Thank you. And do you, I mean, I'm not sure this is kind of typically part of the report, but do you guys ever provide recommendations to lawmakers about how they can address, upcoming issues? I know AI is kind of the big one this year, but is that ever part of the report?
Yeah, sometimes. So I think, thankfully, Tennessee's been pretty proactive on this. I think they've already got a working group in the state government kind of thinking through a lot of this and have some people that know a lot more about AI than I do, honestly, kind of thinking through this and offering some policy recommendations.
Gotcha. And I just had one more question.
Sure.
Um, you were talking about how I guess we kind of saw an increase in the number of open jobs because I mean the economy was doing well coming out of the pandemic, and I guess is the expectation that that will eventually normalize just to the fact that a lot of employers might just take those listings off. you know,
Yeah, so I think as the economy's kind of economic growth, as economic growth is slowing down, we have already seen kind of the number of job openings start to fall back to, they're still above pre-pandemic levels, but they're starting to recede to be a lot closer than they were just a year ago. And my expectation is that's going to continue as economic growth continues to moderate.
gotcha. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, Larry. Scott Barker with Compass in Knoxville. Was going to ask the um, portion of the report on the Tennessee economy noted that it doesn't include uh, obviously anything about the Trump administration's proposals or ideas that have been floated, that sort of thing. And because actually none of them are proposals. I understand that, but how valuable does the fact that he has this administration or he has made some dramatic uh, changes, proposed changes. He would like to make some dramatic proposed changes. How much of a grain of salt should we take the economic forecast for the state because of that?
Yeah, so it's tough. We talked about this a lot in the office and kind of how to think through this. And so the forecast, as we mentioned in that chapter, it doesn't account for any hypothetical policy changes under the incoming administration. And it's really because when assessing the potential economic effects of policy changes, details just really, really matter. And we don't have a good sense as to what the administration is going to do regarding to things like trade, immigration, and tax reform. That being said, at the end of chapter one of the report, which is on the US economy, we do have a brief write-up on alternative forecast scenarios, and we discuss how things like trade and immigration would likely have a negative effect on economic growth, while tax cuts and deregulation could provide a positive boost. It's just hard to put any numbers to those until we get like details of actual policy changes that are put in place.
Okay, Larry, I'll jump back in again.
Please do.
um, what specifically with the state's economy? What um, are the areas that are the most concern economically that you see?
Yeah, I think housing is probably the biggest, both for the state and the nation as a whole. I think housing prices have just gotten unsustainably high for a large portion of the population. So inflation has come down a ton, but I think we're at 2.7% now overall inflation. But the main driver of that is still rising housing prices. And even if the inflation portion of home prices come down, the actual, so that's like a change in home prices from one year to the next. The actual level of prices, I can't imagine it's going to come down too much. So it's going to continue to be a pretty big issue for people, and it's taking up a huge portion of a lot of people's kind of monthly budget. So that means they have less money to spend on other goods and services throughout the economy, and that can lead to slower economic growth as a whole.
How does wage growth compare to the rate of increase for housing costs?
Yeah, so right now, wage growth has been pretty strong. I think this last year it was over 6%, and we're predicting it to be over 6% again this year. Whereas I believe housing costs rose by 3 or 4% this last year. Rose by a lot more the year prior to that, though. So wages have been um, kind of on average have been exceeding housing costs at least this past year. But again, it varies considerably across jobs, across industries, across sectors, and demographics and things like that. So while average wages might be increasing a fair bit, that doesn't mean that everybody's wages are going up.
I think that covers my questions, unless anyone else has anything.
I'll have one more, Larry. Scott Barker again. I asked about the biggest concern. you had. What um, uh, is the most positive um, aspect of the state's economy moving forward? I mean, the report spends a lot of time talking about how it's GDP, incomes, employment are all moderating, and I don't know if that I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but what are the more positive indicators?
Yeah, I think overall this is still a positive outlook for Tennessee. I think it's more of we're just coming off of this really strong economic growth during the economic recovery, and there was a worry that we would, or the U.S. would enter a recession afterwards. But it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. It seems like we're heading for that soft landing and going to see kind of slower but still positive economic growth going forward. I think two other really strong positives are we have an incredibly low unemployment rate in Tennessee. It's down to 3.3%, which is historically just way lower than we usually see. And also, we've seen really strong growth in like education and healthcare services and employment in that sector. And I foresee that continuing over the long term too, as the population continues to age. We'll just have more demand for healthcare workers over time as well. So I think those are two definitely positive aspects of the state economy.
Why were there concerns about a recession after the pandemic? Was just because growth was happening so quickly, and there were concerns about the sustainability of that.
Yeah, it was between that, but both that and then just incredibly high inflation. So there was worries that consumers would start spending a lot less. And both the state and the national economies, they're really just driven almost primarily by consumption spending. About two-thirds of all of the economic growth in the US is attributable to consumption spending. So the worry was that inflation would lead to lower consumption spending, and that would be a drag on GDP growth going forward. And then add to that, during kind of the battle on inflation, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates incredibly high. And that was purposefully to try to reduce economic activity and therefore reduce prices and then get inflation to come down. So the thought was that that would also be a drag on economic growth going forward. But it seems like they've been successful in reducing inflation to an extent without leading to negative economic growth.
I know this is kind of like a subject to debate, but I mean, how much of that could be like traced back to the policies of the Biden administration versus the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a combination of all of them, right? It's really hard to tease any of that out.
Gotcha. Thanks again. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
of course. Thank you. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. Unless there's any other questions.
I think I'm good.
Cool. All right. Thank you all again.